The audience stopped clapping. Tears were streaming down Steve Harvey's face. In that moment, everyone understood, this wasn't just a show anymore. The studio lights felt different that day. Brighter somehow. More real. Steve Harvey stood frozen between the two family podiums, his microphone hanging loose in his hand. His signature smile was gone. In its place was something raw, something vulnerable, something that 30 years of television had never prepared him for. Behind him, the Family Feud board glowed with its familiar blue light. The game was supposed to continue. The clock was supposed to tick. The families were supposed to compete. But none of that mattered anymore. Because standing at the blue podium was a man who had just said 7 words that stopped everything. "I'm just grateful I made it home." 7 words. That's all it took to break down one of the most powerful men in entertainment. But to understand why those words carried such weight, we need to go back. Back to the beginning of that day, when everything seemed normal. When it was just another episode of America's favorite game show. But nothing about this day would be normal. And what happened next would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. The morning had started like any other taping day at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta. 2 families waited backstage, practicing their fastest buzzer reflexes, going over their game strategy, trying to calm their nerves. On one side, the Martinez family, 3 generations of teachers from Arizona, led by Maria Martinez, a grandmother who had watched the show religiously for 20 years. On the other side, the Dawson family from North Carolina. Jim Dawson, the family captain, was a quiet man with gray hair and steady hands. His wife Sarah stood beside him, their 2 adult children flanking them. They seemed like any other American family. Excited, nervous, ready to play. But Jim Dawson carried something the cameras couldn't see. Something that would change everything. The production crew ran through their standard pre-show routine. Lights were checked. Cameras were positioned. The audience was warmed up by a comedian who told them when to clap, when to cheer, when to react. Everything was choreographed. Everything was controlled. This was television, after all. Nothing was left to chance. Steve Harvey arrived at his usual time, dressed in one of his impeccable 3-piece suits, this one a deep charcoal gray with a burgundy tie. He did what he always did, reviewed the questions, joked with the crew, made sure his energy was right. He had hosted thousands of episodes. He knew the rhythm. He knew the game. He had no idea that in less than an hour, he would break his own rules. The show opened with its familiar energy. Steve welcomed both families with his trademark humor, making jokes about their names, their accents, their nervous energy. The audience laughed. The families relaxed. It was exactly what they had come for. The first round went smoothly. The Martinez family won control of the board with a strong answer about things you find in a grandmother's purse. Steve did his signature reactions, his exaggerated facial expressions that had made him a viral sensation. Everything was going according to script. But then came the second round. Face Off. Jim Dawson versus Maria Martinez. Steve read the question. Name something you're grateful for every single day. It was meant to be a simple question. An easy one. Family. Health. Life. Food. The answers were obvious. Predictable. Safe. Jim Dawson hit his buzzer first. Steve turned to him with that familiar smile, ready for a standard answer. What are you grateful for every single day, Jim? Jim looked at Steve. Really looked at him. And for the first time that day, Steve noticed something in the man's eyes. Something that made him pause. A depth. A weight. A story. I'm just grateful I made it home. The words hung in the air. Simple. Direct. But somehow carrying the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Steve's smile faded. His comedy instinct, usually so sharp, so quick, went silent. He knew. In that instant, he knew this wasn't a game show answer. This was something else. Say that again, Steve said quietly, stepping closer to Jim's podium. The studio froze. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how the show worked. But something was happening that was bigger than the show. "I'm grateful I made it home," Jim repeated, his voice steady but soft. "From Afghanistan. Because not all of my brothers did." The audience went quiet. Not the produced quiet of a commercial break. The real quiet. The kind that only happens when something true breaks through the noise. Steve Harvey set his microphone down on the podium. A veteran host never puts down the mic. It's the cardinal rule of live television. But Steve wasn't thinking about rules anymore. He walked away from his mark, away from the center stage position where he was supposed to stand. He walked directly to Jim Dawson and stood in front of him, forgetting the cameras, forgetting the game, forgetting everything except the man in front of him. "How long were you deployed?" Steve asked. 3 tours. 15 months total. "What did you do over there?" "I was a combat medic. Took care of the guys who got hit." Steve's jaw tightened. The audience watched in complete silence. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something sacred unfolding in real time. "Did you lose anybody?" Steve asked. Jim nodded slowly. 5 men. 5 men I couldn't save. And that's when it happened. Steve Harvey, the man who had laughed through thousands of shows, who had made millions laugh, who had built a career on never-breaking character, broke. Tears welled up in his eyes. His lips pressed together. He raised one hand to his face, trying to compose himself, but the emotion was too strong. Too real. Too raw. The cameras kept rolling. The producers in the booth didn't call cut. They knew better. They knew they were witnessing something that couldn't be produced, couldn't be scripted, couldn't be faked. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He was about to do something he had never done in his entire career. Steve turned to the audience, his face wet with tears, and spoke directly to them. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice cracked slightly, "I need you to understand something. This man standing here, Jim Dawson, is a hero. A real hero. Not a movie hero. Not a sports hero. A man who put his life on the line so we could sit here today and play a game show." The audience began to stand. Slowly at first, then all at once. Spontaneous. Unrehearsed. Real. But Steve wasn't done. He looked at the Martinez family, the opposing team. "Maria, would you and your family come over here, please?" Maria Martinez, tears already streaming down her face, led her family around the podium to where Jim Dawson stood. This wasn't how the game worked. Teams weren't supposed to leave their positions. But nobody cared about the rules anymore. Steve looked at both families, at the audience, at the cameras. "I want everyone here to understand what gratitude really means. We throw that word around. We say we're grateful for our coffee, for our cars, for winning some points on a game show. But this man knows gratitude in a way most of us never will. He's grateful for breath. For life. For making it home when his brothers didn't." Jim Dawson stood quietly, his shoulders back, his dignity intact, as Steve spoke. He wasn't seeking attention. He wasn't trying to make a moment. He had simply answered a question honestly, and it had revealed a truth too powerful to ignore. Steve reached up and began to unbutton his suit jacket. The audience watched, confused. What was he doing? He pulled off the jacket, that expensive, perfectly tailored charcoal gray jacket, and held it in his hands. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Jim. "Jim, I want you to have this." Jim shook his head. "Steve, I can't." "Yes, you can," Steve interrupted. "You need to understand something. This jacket, this show, this career I have, none of it matters compared to what you did. What you sacrificed. What you carry. I need you to take this as a reminder that your service, your sacrifice, your brothers who didn't make it home, they will never be forgotten. Not by me. Not by anyone watching this." Steve draped the jacket over Jim's shoulders. The audience erupted. Not in applause, but in something deeper. A collective release of emotion. People were crying openly. The opposing family was crying. The crew was crying. Even the stone-faced cameramen had tears in their eyes. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Jim Dawson reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, his hands shaking slightly. "Can I read something?" he asked Steve. Steve nodded, unable to speak. Jim looked down at the paper, then back up at the audience. "This is a letter my sergeant wrote to his daughter the night before he died. He asked me to hold on to it, to make sure she got it. I was with him when he wrote it. I was with him when he died. And I carried this letter home." The studio was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Jim began to read, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "My sweet girl, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. But I need you to know that I died grateful. Grateful for every sunrise I got to see. Grateful for your mother's love. Grateful for your laugh. Grateful that I got to be your dad, even if it was for too short a time. Don't be sad for me. Be grateful. Be grateful for every ordinary day, because there's no such thing as an ordinary day. Every day is a miracle. Every day is a gift. Be grateful, baby girl. Always be grateful." Jim folded the letter carefully and put it back in his pocket. When he looked up, his eyes were dry, but his face carried the weight of 1,000 memories. "That's what gratitude means to me, Steve. Every day I wake up, I remember Sergeant Mike Davis. I remember that he doesn't get to wake up. He doesn't get to see another sunrise. He doesn't get to watch his daughter grow up. So when you ask me what I'm grateful for, the answer is simple. I'm grateful I made it home. Because it means I get to keep his memory alive. I get to tell his story. I get to make sure his sacrifice meant something." Steve Harvey stood there, his face a portrait of raw emotion, his expensive suit jacket now draped over a veteran's shoulders, and did something he had never done in thousands of shows. He hugged Jim Dawson. Not a quick TV hug. A real embrace. The kind that says, "I see you. I hear you. You matter." The cameras captured it all. The producers let it play out. Because they knew they were watching something that transcended television. This was humanity. This was truth. This was what happens when someone has the courage to be real in a world obsessed with performance. When Steve finally pulled back, he looked at Jim and said, "Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for coming home. Thank you for reminding all of us what really matters." Then Steve did something even more unexpected. He turned to the production booth and spoke into his lapel mic. "Stop the show. We're not finishing this game. I don't care about the points. I don't care about the board. This man and his family have already won everything that matters." The producers were stunned. This had never happened. Shows don't just stop. There were commercial breaks to hit, sponsors to satisfy, a format to follow. But Steve Harvey was the boss. And in that moment, he used his power to do something unprecedented. "Jim Dawson, both of your families are walking out of here today with the grand prize. $20,000 each. Because you've taught us all something worth more than any money. You've taught us what real gratitude looks like." The audience went wild. Both families embraced each other, crying, laughing, understanding that they had just been part of something extraordinary. Steve picked up his microphone again and faced the cameras directly. "To everyone watching at home, I want you to hear me clearly. We live in a world that tells us to be grateful when things go well. When we get what we want. When life is easy. But Jim Dawson has shown us that real gratitude, the kind that changes your life, comes from understanding how fragile it all is. How precious it all is. How none of it is guaranteed." He paused, composing himself. "So tonight, when you sit down at your dinner table, when you kiss your kids goodnight, when you crawl into your bed, I want you to remember Sergeant Mike Davis. I want you to remember all the men and women who didn't make it home. And I want you to be grateful. Truly, deeply grateful. Not just for the big things. For the ordinary things. For the breath in your lungs. For the people you love. For the simple fact that you're here. Share this video and subscribe, because this story needs to be remembered forever. After the cameras stopped rolling, something remarkable happened. Steve Harvey kept that moment with him forever. He later said it was the day he stopped hosting a show and started honoring lives. Jim Dawson still wears that charcoal gray jacket. And every time he does, he remembers Sergeant Mike Davis. He remembers the brothers who didn't make it home. And he remembers the day a game show became something sacred. The letter Jim read that day? He delivered it to Sergeant Davis's daughter 6 months later. She was 18. She cried. And then she thanked Jim for keeping her father's memory alive. That's the power of gratitude. Real gratitude. The kind that changes everything.